been given. So in this case, one of the resolution was to establish a climate policy, and the affirmative argument was that the AF was a way to adapt to climate change, which by a policy definition is a climate policy. And then there's sort of the main first piece of offense is not an impact turn to the strategy of framework, but is rather a net benefit to the affirmative's form of education. And the rest of it sort of looks basically like that. Defense to instrumental policymaking rather than a more sort of explicit impact turn to the topical version of the app. Prior question arguments that have external offense to framework. So it's not necessarily impact turning framework, just having a sort of disad to their interpretation that is based on the exclusion of the affirmative rather than a sort of broader model indictment. The fairness argument, rather than saying that the offense is based on fairness being bad intrinsically, is rather saying that the way is a disad more to thinking that things can be predictable. So the internal links rather than eternal impact. And then the education debate I basically already explained, that we solve topic education better than they do. So this is obviously not, framework 2ACs aren't going to be cookie cutter. What this sort of demonstrates the way how you can construct your 2AC with their particular 2AR strategy in mind. Because even though there's a lot of stuff in this 2AC, I always knew that the 2AR was going to be basically the same. Defense to their offense to the AF, there's a net benefit to including the AF. The net benefit argument changed, but that skeleton is functionally the same in every debate. So this is an example of a more impact turn strategy. So this affirmative basically didn't talk about the topic at all, and made arguments about how the way that the resolution has positioned us as subjects was a sort of anti-feminine, masculinist form of knowledge production. So the framework strategy, I'm going to start with an earlier block. Okay, so okay, here we go. All right, so this is the first version of this 2AC block. So you'll notice that I did not even bother making a leading argument because I knew I wanted to impact turn the idea of being in line with the resolution. So there was no point in me making a defensive argument at the top that I knew was never going to be in the 2AR. You'll notice the counterinterpretation here, rather than being a counterinterpretation that is in the direction of the resolution, is a counterinterpretation focused on expanding the resolution. So it argued that teams should be able to advocate for what was absent in the resolution rather than just what was present. Yes, obviously links to negative offense about limits. But if I'm going to impact turn that anyway, I don't have to worry as much about making the counterinterpretation seem fair or seem reasonable. And then when you get to the sort of deliberation debate, again, not making a claim about being deliberative or leading to the same education, but rather saying that the very fact that the negative said that we should have been deliberating, that links to our offense and is directly impact turn. So it's the terminal impact is where we're getting that disad from. And then here we see arguments about the idea of advocating for a fair debate space is something that should be rejected, that's something that doesn't exist, that the affirmative would endorse a form of debate that doesn't demand fairness and stuff like that. So another point I sort of want to make is that even this version didn't have a lot of evidence in it. You'll see the expanded versions. It's every single block has 1 or 2 cards. But you'll notice these are the blocks that I made for this affirmative at the beginning of the year. By the end by the beginning of the first semester, that was my entire 2AC block. So this, one card, and that. That was the whole thing. It took me 3 minutes. Now, the reason why I went down to this is because I figured out at way too late in the game something that's pretty, I think, key about writing 2ACs to framework and answering framework is that you never need as many cards as you think you do. I cut probably like 50 framework cards for this app, and I read 2 in every debate. 1, because I was slow, but 2, also because when it came down to it, I never needed much more than what was in the 1AC. And this is not to say that like because I wrote the perfect 1AC, then my 2ACs were efficient. That's not what I'm saying. But this is true for a lot of K-debate, but I think especially in framework, is that you will always get more from explaining your affirmative than you will from reading new cards. 1, because if you're reading something that has a sort of basis in high theory, you'll get more ground from making sure that the judges understand the argument that you're making, but also that odds are that you will always be ahead in the debate if the debate is about your spin and interpretation of your affirmative rather than just the sort of taglines of cards that you have read. Because the reason why, and this isn't true for all framework teams, but the reason why most negative teams are reading framework in the first place is because they have decided that it is more strategic to invest time in that generic than it is to spend time deep in the literature of critical affirmatives, which means that if you make the debate on the details of your literature, you will be 10 times, that was a bit, not 10 times. You will be much, much, much further ahead in terms of argumentation, and you will always be able to outspin them if you start that debate earlier. And the other part of it is just that like the more cards you read, the more opportunities the negative team has to find like random quotes that seem to be talking about framework or that seem to say that some policymaking might be good in the future. And especially if you're in a situation where you have a judge that's sort of like on the fence about it, which if you're in a clash debate, the odds are that that's most of your judges, that you just want to decrease the opportunities for the team to sort of gain that edge of just like common sense or like common assumptions, I guess. Because essentially what framework comes down to is being ahead on the spin game. If you reading fewer cards will almost always get you to that objective. Okay, so we have like 20 more minutes left. Does anyone have any questions?
Can we talk about entering black frame? That's not.
So are you just saying that like pragmatism is good but not for policy reasons?
And also like existential ethics stuff. I don't know. They're reading the black framework. That's easy.
Okay, so okay, yeah. So basically the 2AC to that is usually just the framework 2AC minus all the like procedurals. So you can make the same arguments about like policy making that you would. You just need to add arguments. Let's see. Basically, in that situation, you just want to take out the answers to fairness and add like 1 or 2 sort of base answers that you would read against the critique against your app. Because essentially, in any framework debate, the debate is about where the focus of the debate should be. You are saying the focus of the debate should be on your app, whether it's traditional framework or a more critical framework. The negative argument is always that we should shift the focus to something else. So depending on what that is, you might be pulling from a 2AC to another critique, maybe your 2AC to the anti-blackness critique, and then combining that with your criticism of pragmatism or policymaking. And then you also, I think the other argument you probably want to make is that it's like, regardless of what the arguments are in that given debate, that negative strategy, to the extent that they try to no-link to your broader criticisms of framework, can be co-opted by the more like traditional framework teams to be used to further excise radical thought from the debate community. So even though with that framework argument, they're obviously saying that like we should have criticism, it just has to be tied to a praxis. The argument that you want to make is that the fact that you're still making this as a framework argument rather than a criticism means that this can now be like co-opted as an example for like the most fascist of framework debaters to take everything that isn't strict policymaking out of the debate community, which is net worse. Which means that in that situation, even though if against traditional framework you would go for the impact turn, you also probably want to shift to a more defensive strategy and read the permutation counter interp. That's what I would say.
Okay.
Now, I need you to explain what you mean by that.
Oh, okay.
Existential ethics.
So it says like this is the framework process, like affirmative interpretation of political change represents like Eurocentric notions of ethics. So like if you're running a K on the app, how would you like answer that? Like our app isn't coming from a Eurocentric perspective towards like blackness or whatever it is.
Can I see this? Okay, basically what I would say to answer that is answered in the similar way that you would answer the like view from nowhere argument or like academy argument, because essentially what that argument is saying is that that like the app has constructed a binary between ethics and action, and is basically it's just a flowery way of the sort of like trade-off with praxis argument. And they're calling it existential ethics to make it sound like something else. But the argument is just that by only criticizing, we convince ourselves that we can never do anything practical. So then, quote unquote, real material change gets left by the wayside. But the argument that you likely want to make is that one, the affirmative is not trapped in criticism, but we cannot take a practical action without questioning the like telos of that action. And if the affirmative is a criticism of the way that most sort of pragmatism gets funneled into a particular telos, then the affirmative is obviously a prerequisite. You also the like just simple defense of that argument is like the app isn't detached from the material, which in most cases is true, although with some chaos, like, yeah, you probably are, but then you probably have a more explicit impact.
So when you're running K on the app, how do you include preamps to like expecting framework in order to like make it easier to answer the 2AC?
That's a good question. So let me pull up.
Doesn't that also get you to like bad situations against good framework teams though? Because then they're like, I don't know. I remember we had like GBM one time and we had framework preamps and they're like, that's just proof of why the existence of critical apps are bad because they're meant only to impact our framework.
That's silly because basically a lot of those arguments it becomes so obvious that they're only made because people don't want to debate chaos, because it's like every policy app has preempts to the most probable 1NC strategy. But that doesn't mean those apps are bad. It's like if your app only links to, if your app really links to the spending disad, you're going to have a card in the solvency contention that says it doesn't cost a lot of money. That doesn't mean the app is unfair.
Okay,
So, yeah. So, basically the way that you want to, let's see. The way that you want to include preempts is basically disguising them as solvency or uniqueness arguments. So this is the feminism app that I was talking about. So it had like one card about the resolution that had a criticism of traditional policymaking embedded within it. So a lot of times your like link to the topic will already have a framework preempt in it because it's criticizing the like traditional mode of approaching that topic. And this is also that. And then so here's an example of having a preempt sort of disguised as a uniqueness argument. I mean, it was a uniqueness argument, but so we had this argument that basically was like a criticism of language and the symbolic order, and said that like before we approach any question, it has all these assumptions or whatever, and had a lot of stuff down here about like liberalism and liberal democracy that was just sort of highlighted in. So it's like a uniqueness argument that is a broader argument for the app, but has a very explicit application to framework. Like here's another one. So this is our solvency argument, and it had like a whole chunk about like playing with text that we knew we were going to use for the counter interpretation. And okay, that was the card we put in. We were doing another case, which means this is the right version. And then at the end, having like a prerequisite argument is also helpful because it's like, yeah, it's obvious that you put this in the 1AC because you know you're going to debate framework, but it also functions as a solvency argument because it's like you started out by saying that there's like a problem related to the topic, and if you end to say the app is a prerequisite to doing things that would actually fix that problem, then it is both a solvency argument and a framework preempt. Basically, it's like if you're writing an app that you know you are writing to run against framework teams, when you are cutting cards for the 1AC generally, you should just always be keeping an eye out and highlighting lines and just like paragraphs that might be applicable to framework, because in most cases, just naturally, the cards that you'll be cutting for the 1AC will be asking a lot of the same questions that you want to have in a framework debate. So, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, then that's all I have. We're eating lunch at the Globe today, which is a little bit farther. So if you all want to start heading over there, you can do that.
Where's that at?
It's okay. It's on Mason Pond. The best thing I would recommend doing is just putting it into Google Maps, honestly. But you basically just walk sort of past the buildings where lab are, and then get on the Mason Pond Road and take it around. So let me. So it's like a 10-minute walk, but I've heard the food is amazing from the students.
Is it a restaurant or is it?
No, it's a dining hall.
Okay.
So this is us. These are the buildings where labs are, and you basically just like walk through straight through campus, and it's over there. So it is a little far, but I mean, like, do what you want. But all the Mason students have told me it's like worth the 10 minutes. So.
All right.
Yeah.